over 70 anime are coming out next season. Then it's out of those 70 that I'm sure are all unique and original that 23 of them are either in isekai or fantasy. We're about to find out whether any of those look good or not, but can we just take a moment to acknowledge how absurd that is? 70 new anime is just ridiculous. I feel like we're at this weird place in the industry where it's all quantity over quality. Like, are there actually people watching half these anime, or are studios just gambling with IPs until one actually sticks? I don't know, but as long as there's at least one good isekai per season, that's pretty much all I need to keep myself satisfied. So, to start things off with the sequels, first we have the stacked trio of Shield Hero, Goblin Slayer, and Eminence in Shadow. Shield Hero had a bit of a rocky season 2, but if the new season's gonna look anything like how the trailer does, I'm actually pretty confident it might be able to make a comeback. In fact, with the director having changed to the assistant director from Made in Abyss, I'm willing to bet that season 3 might actually be decent. I can't say for sure given the damage that's been done during the Spirit Tortoise arc, but the staff seems a bit more stacked and there's actually a tournament mixed in this arc. So if you're like me and dropped Shield Hero halfway through last season, I think giving it another shot might leave you pleasantly surprised this season. Goblin Slayer does more of what it does best, except this time around it'll introduce several new characters, one of which is a mage like Cliff. He goes by the name of Wizard and he thinks himself to be this superior young prodigy. But just like how it is with Goblin Slayer, so too does this wizard want to hunt only goblins. So it's him and the rest of the main party that find themselves teaming up together to deal with, well, goblins. Then with much of the core staff returning, you can expect this season to be just as good as the last one. The only difference is that the studio doing it is Liden Films instead of White Fox. As for Eminence in Shadow, since I was already lucky enough to watch episode 1 at Anime Expo, I can tell you with absolute confidence that season 2 is gonna be just as good or even better than season 1. I don't know if we'll ever get a flex as hard as this one again, but believe me when I say that everything we loved about season 1 is gonna be here in season 2 too. Add in vampires, Bloodborne-esque vampire hunters, and a power struggle between 3 egotistical monarchs, and what you get is the perfect stage for more of Sid's shenanigans. So I think that's gonna be the anime that I cover this season. Obviously, I don't think that I can cover all 3, but if there's one that you'd prefer for cut content over the other, then let me know down in the comments so I can gauge just how much interest there is for them. Continuing with more of the other sequels, next we have The Faraway Paladin. I can't say that this was something I was too interested in the first season, but perhaps the overhaul of both its staff and studio might make season 2 a bit more appealing. Apparently, this arc is quite literally the anime version of The Hobbit. So, if you're a fan of lengthy adventures in a world of high fantasy, then feel free to check out this one this season. Next is The Saint's Magic Power is Omnipotent, which if you're looking for a wholesome, peaceful anime, then this is definitely the one for you. It's a plain vanilla isekai that shows the life of a hero who doesn't actually have to do any of the hero work. They instead just get to live their new relaxing life the way that they want to. So, if you liked the calm, tranquil nature of season 1, then that's pretty much what to expect from season 2. The Ancient Magus' Bride returns with part 2 of season 2, so if you want more of one of the better high fantasy stories out there, this is the one that you're probably going to want to check out this season. Seven Deadly Sins is back with another sequel, but unlike how the previous ones were CGI messes solely intended to milk the hype, this is a proper continuation with what looks to be decent animation. It takes place 16 years after the main story, and the studio doing it is no longer Studio Dean anymore. It's instead the same studio that brought us Tower of God and Orange. Then, last but not least in the sequels, is the return of Arknights in Perish and Frost. Season 1 was a lot of setup and world building, whereas this now brings us into an actual arc. An arc that I hear is going to be pretty exciting. I know other mobile game anime don't often do well, but this one is actually surprisingly decent. So if you want to see where all that gacha money is going, then you can find it in all its glory here in the anime. Now, as far as isekai go in all the new anime, there aren't actually very many to talk about this season. It seems a lot of the fantasies are purely that. No reincarnation and no otherworldly transportation, just some good old magic and wizardry. Out of the ones that we do have, the first I guess is Buta Liver, the story of a man who reincarnated as a pig. That may be an immediate write-off to some of you, but if reincarnated as a vending machine can somehow be good, then I have zero doubt that a pig can get the job done too. It's a comedic story about an otaku turned pig who then meets a girl capable of understanding him. The two become acquainted shortly after, and it's their adventure together that makes this isekai what it is. Next we have the typical Villainess Isekai because for some reason we can't go one season without one. No, seriously. Out of the past 6 seasons there's been 5. So, just like all the others before it, I'm in love with the Villainess is exactly that. An ordinary office worker wakes up as the protagonist of one of her favorite otome games, then uses her in-game knowledge to romance the game's antagonist. It's a Yuri anime based off the surprisingly highly rated novel from 2021. I'd mentioned this next anime before, but if you haven't heard, this is I Shall Survive Using Potions, an isekai by Studio Jamando, which if you're one of the more cultured, you'll know what they're known for. But in this world where magic isn't really prevalent, an office worker that's reincarnated with the ability to make potions becomes the target of people seeking that power for themselves. You see, since her potions are the closest thing to magic, I guess you could say they're the element of her character that makes her OP. It's also the driving factor behind a lot of the core story elements. Moving on to just straight up fantasy now, first we have the highly anticipated Frieren, an emotional story unlike any other that I'm sure will be Madhouse's biggest hit since Overlord. In a world where the Demon Lord has just been defeated, the party responsible can finally return home after their decade-long journey doing so. Since the main character Frieren is an elf though, the length of her life is much longer than all the others. So, as time passes and her companions start to die one by one, Frieren embarks on a journey with an apprentice of one of her old party members, then proceeds to revisit a lot of the places that she went with her original party, often realizing all the missed opportunities she could have had to become closer with them. That being the case, it's a story that looks at what happens after the whole Slay the Demon Lord mission, one that showcases what life is like for those who live longer than most. Something that's a bit more basic is the Demon Swordmaster of Excalibur Academy. A Demon Lord awakens 1,000 years later in the body of a 10-year-old, then proceeds to find himself in this post-apocalyptic era of monsters versus humans. So, rather than the typical medieval fantasy we're used to, society has actually advanced quite a bit and all their resources are now being used to fight against these void monsters. It's an interesting premise that makes me wonder how a reincarnated Demon Lord might fit into it. Another fantasy with quite a bit of action is Studio Silverlink's adaptation of Ragna Crimson, a world where dragons rule mostly everything, and if any person wishes to survive, they must first surpass the limits of a normal human's strength. The story follows one of said people, and it's while on this path to become a stronger dragon hunter that they're joined by a mysterious companion who wants the same thing as him. Obviously there's a little bit more to it than that, but the core essence is mainly a protagonist that needs to become stronger to protect his friend. Next we have the Vexations of a shut-in vampire princess. After a shut-in vampire awakens to find herself commander of an imperial army unit, she must prove herself capable of leading it in these mandatory wars fought every 3 months or so. If she doesn't, then not only will she lose her position as their commander, but her own soldiers would likely turn on her. They don't seem to acknowledge those who are weaker than them. So, with this shut-in vampire being one that doesn't even drink blood, already her public image is that of being inept, leading to this misfit commander having to either step up to her position or get left behind and meet a demise at the hands of her own subordinates. It's a deceptively interesting premise that seems to carry quite a few layers to it. Another video game fantasy coming out next season is a playthrough of a certain dude's VRMMO life. Unlike the anime before this though, apparently this one doesn't capture the whole video game aspect well. It's about a guy who masters a skill supposedly no one thought to have used before, then somehow becomes OP while doing so. Anything else I can't really comment on. Speedrunning through the next few now. There's giving the disgraced noble lady I rescued a crash course in naughtiness, which is the story of a dark wizard demon lord who takes in a noble girl in exile. The girl starts off rather innocent, but this dark lord decides to lead her down a path of indulgence. Thus the whole naughtiness in the title thing. The next is Tearmoon Empire, which follows the story of a selfish princess who'd just been executed. It was right after it happened, though, that this princess would awaken back in her 12-year-old body again, giving her a second chance to redo a lot of the things that she got wrong the first time. So, whether it be corruption, border issues, or economic strife, this princess will fix all of it in order to avoid the guillotine again. Another anime somewhat similar to this is A Returner's magic should be special. The world's at war and on the brink of extinction, and the only people who can stop it aren't quite strong enough. They're a special group of magicians who have been training their whole life for this. It's right as the last of these magicians were about to meet their doom that they would instead find themselves back in their student life. So it's another instance of time travel giving the protagonist a second chance again. The only difference between this and the last one, though, is that the main character in this one is actually trying to save everyone, not just trying to save themselves. Berserk of Gluttony brings us a straight-up action fantasy in which an underestimated protagonist is given the power to gain even more power. He's not OP right from the get-go, but is instead given the opportunity to become OP, a feat only possible through a skill called Gluttony, which allows him to feast on the souls of anyone he kills, taking all their power as his own in the process. At first, this series starts with our protagonist getting bullied, but it's as he discovers his power and makes himself stronger that we start to get into something similar to Arifureta, a badass MC who doesn't hesitate to act when it's necessary. Next is My Daughter Left the Nest and Returned an S-Rank Adventurer, which, as I'm sure you expect, is pretty much that. A retired wannabe adventurer finds a baby deep in the mountains, then raises that baby until she's old enough to become an adventurer herself. 5 years later, and this girl is now the S-ranked adventurer her father always wanted to be, leaving her no other desire but to go back and spend time with her father again. Now, the last anime on our list is The Family Circumstances of the Irregular Witch, a witch who finds a human baby then raises her as her own. You're not gonna believe which one's the witch and which one's the daughter, but if you're curious to find out, then I'll leave that as a surprise for you. It's a comedic fantasy that adapts the 4-koma style of the manga. But yeah, that's pretty much every isekai and fantasy coming out next season. If any of these sounded interesting, then feel free to let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear which of these that you plan on watching. Also, feel free to subscribe if you enjoyed the content. I'll be doing Eminence and Shadow for the most part of this season, but I'll try to sprinkle in some other new stuff and maybe even some Shield Hero and Goblin Slayer. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!